All right, so I guess we will get started for today. These are starting survey research today, and we'll be done it today, I would expect. So, I mean, we still have a fair bit to get through before ability sampling or different sampling methods that are quantitative, and kind of get ourselves going, thinking about that, which you'll need for your which you will need for your major lab, right? You'll have to think about survey questions. So I've got a couple more. I searched for bad survey question examples on Google to try and figure out what some bad survey questions were. So I think I've got 3 other kind of survey questions just to kind of get us thinking about it again, and then we'll move on and get into some content. Okay, so this is number 1 of them. If you were to look at, I almost spilled coffee on myself. If you were to look at this question, anything at all wrong with it that you think could be improved? Like, what could you do better? Yeah, Joan.
It's not exhaustive enough.
It's not exhaustive. What do you mean when you say it's not exhaustive enough?
It doesn't have enough options. The choices for breakfast are pretty limited.
Okay. And why is that a problem?
Because people may not like it. Like, there are lots of people who don't eat anything.
Okay. Of course, right. So they might not be able to answer anything because they just don't know what it is. Yeah, sorry, what's your name?
Brian.
Brian, okay.
I'm blind. Can you read the question?
You're blind? I gotcha. I can make it bigger. Here. Sorry. On my.
It's the only desk that I fit in, so it's like all the way back.
You want to move it forward? You can always move it forward if you want.
I might do that.
Well, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Which of these would you prefer for breakfast? Tea and bread, coffee, oats, cereal. Now, like, I know these are kind of laughable in a sense, but in kind of looking at, was it Caitlin?
Yeah.
Okay.
It could be that, like, because tea and bread is like a combined option and the other ones are just like singular items. So maybe like respondents are more likely to say like tea and bread because that's more of a meal. You get a food, you get a drink,
right?
And it sort of like will skew the results.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, it's hard. What if you like tea and not bread, right? Like, what if you're just a tea drinker in the morning and tea is not really food, right? It's a drink. So yeah, it can skew things. Yeah, Brian.
I feel like the questions are a bit ambiguous and a bit vague a little bit because it's like you can say tea and bread, but what kind of tea is it? And what if I only like eating whole wheat? Or what kind of oats is it? Is it quick oats or is it like a different kind of oats and like cereal? It's like I only eat Lucky Charms, so if it's nothing but that, then it's like,
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, it's still not exhaustive enough. Yeah. Please. Sorry. Your name.
Theodora.
Theodora. Okay.
And I feel like you could have multiple answers. So like if I like coffee and oats, I can't pick both.
Right. Okay. So that could be fixed potentially by having like a select all that apply, right? What else could you do to fix it? Yeah, John.
You kind of change the coffee answer because coffee usually isn't breakfast alone, except like maybe lunch or something. It's like usually added with breakfast. So like, what if you want like coffee, but you like coffee with like I don't know, like eggs or something? Like, do you pick the coffee option or
eggs? Right. I only drink coffee in the morning. I never eat anything. It would ruin the flavor. No, I don't know. I hate breakfast food in general. That's a quirk that I have. And sometimes, not today, but like Friday, I generally forget to eat, so I get to dinner time, and all I've had during the day is coffee, which is probably incredibly healthy for you, I think. Okay, yeah. And how would you, like, any thoughts on how to fix this? Like, what would you need to do to make this a better question on a survey? Or should it just be, like, sent into the deep dumpster of survey land and just be like, there's nothing, it's terrible? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Like, I think it kind of depends on like why they're asking and what you're trying to get at. If it's like, you're at a continental breakfast and you're trying to figure out which things to serve or something like that, like the way to make it make sense would be to like do a select all that apply and then maybe break that tea and bread, just so you can see like get an idea of like what kinds of things people do want. But like I don't see see it being like for useful in any other context. So,
Yeah, I mean, I could see if someone was trying to like do like a nutrition survey, basically, like to see what people.
but if it was a nutrition survey, then this would be all very much too vague.
Be sorry.
It would be very much too vague.
Yeah, too vague. So you'd need a lot more options, right? A lot more. You couldn't just leave these options and have that. You definitely. Going to on what Joan was saying, I think you probably need an other, and people have a text entry box for something like that, and you'd have to expand those choices. This is like, these are the things I like, not me personally, but like whoever wrote this question, which I found, I swear, Googling bad survey questions. It kind of a strange. Actually, I added cereal because all they had was the first three options, which, really doesn't feel exhausting. Okay, let's try another one. And then I promise I'll stop. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm abusing Brian's eyes. I'll get you like a little spyglass and zoom in. Yeah, binoculars could work. I think I have a pair of bird watching binoculars for reasons I can't explain. I've never gone bird watching in my life, but I have a pair. Okay, on average, how many minutes do you spend on TikTok each day? And here, less than 30, 30 to 60, more than 60. What, if anything, is wrong with this question? Yeah, please.
I feel like the groups that would fall into more than 60 would be very large.
Fair. Yeah, there's probably not enough segmentation on it, for sure. Yeah, Theodora.
Well, if I'm 60, what do I put? Or if I'm 30, wait, never mind.
Okay, sure. Yeah, Brian, go for it.
I feel like it doesn't take into account like the other type of services that are like similar to TikTok. So like Instagram has their own. YouTube
Was it Reels and
YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels? And it's like all kind of similar, but it's like me personally, I'm a person who deleted TikTok, but now I just watch Instagram Reels for over 60 minutes. So it's kind of like, I feel like just generalizing it to just TikTok, you're taking, like, it's not wide.
Fair. Okay. So yeah, or you might want to include, you could have other questions on those other services. Yeah, I've never installed TikTok. I think I see all of TikTok through YouTube Shorts because I think it's basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Half of them have the TikTok logo on them anyway.
Yeah.
Algorithm's way better. It's like,
Oh, probably. Yeah, I just have never installed it, and I'm like, ooh, no, none of these apply to me. But whatever, they just roll and roll and roll, and then it's like, wait, it's night. I started this at 6 a.m. I don't know what happened to my day.
I would never forget TikTok for like the other social media stuff. They all copy, with its popularity, they all copy the Reels formatting to work together. Netflix and Spotify have Reels now. It's all.
Spotify? Wow. I was not aware. Everybody's copying. Yeah, please, Caitlin.
It should maybe include an option that says 0.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess 0 is less than 30, but yeah, it doesn't have
I feel like there's no application for data like that where you wouldn't want to include like I'm not a user versus like I use it but casual,
Right. Yes. So that, I mean, you're on the right track, and it's similar to the example that I gave, the one about the what's your opinion of Stephen King novels, right? Where you have this fundamental thing of like you're kind of asking two questions here, but without asking two questions. And one of them, you should have a screening question, was like, do you use TikTok, right? Or do you go on TikTok each day? And then you can ask people how much or what they think of the platform or whatever. But you're just assuming essentially that everybody goes on TikTok, right? That everybody is a TikTok user without actually checking. And now, I mean, sure, if you get university students, you're probably not far off. But if you had like 40 to 60-year-olds in your sample, there's going to be a large percentage of people who are probably not using TikTok, right? So you fundamentally need really should bring a cup with a cover. Yeah, you need a question that kind of screens. Otherwise, you got problems. Okay. Sorry. Next time, Brian, when I have examples, I'll remember that you sit in the back and You got bad eyes. All right.
I feel like I did it to myself a little.
That's fair. We could move. We can just move stuff forward if you need to. There's no rules against reorganizing the space at all. Okay, so I regularly eat a nutritious breakfast. Strongly agree, too strongly disagree. Yeah, Brian.
Define a nutritious breakfast.
Okay, you got it right away. Yeah, easy, right? Nutritious is an ambiguous term, right? What one person, maybe you think your Lucky Charms for breakfast, right? They fill you full of energy because those. I mean, are you like my kids? You eat just the marshmallows in the box with actually all the cereal. It just stays in the box forever.
When I was a child, I did that, but I moved more towards not eating Lucky Charms every single day.
That's
But
probably for the best. They are sugary garbage for sure.
it's delicious.
They are delicious. Strangely, I still enjoy picking out the occasional rainbow and horseshoe out of the box too. Yeah, Joan.
There's also like, what do you mean by regularly? You mean like every day, every other day? And also, what if like you don't eat breakfast?
Well, then I assume you would strongly disagree. But it's a good question. Like, do you eat breakfast regularly? Is a question that you could ask. And yeah, when I was writing this one, I wrote this one myself. I didn't actually. I can't blame the internet, but right, nutritious I think is the biggest problem here. What does nutritious mean, right? Two people might consider nutritious a lot differently. And this one might actually be difficult to fix, right? Because you'd have to define in your question what a nutritious breakfast sort of looks like. So I don't know what you would say that includes, like foods from several different food groups, or fruits and vegetables, or milk. I don't know. It would be a tough one to fix this particular question. Is your hand up, or you're scratching your head? Okay, cool. Any thoughts? How would you fix this if you were going to fix this? Or again, is it just belong in the dumpster fire of history? Yeah, please.
I would maybe like scrap regularly for something more like I eat a daily nutritious breakfast or whatever, right?
Okay.
Set more of a strict, like qualifying food term regularly, right? Because maybe regularly for you means you eat 2 breakfasts every day, and maybe regularly for you.
I'm a hobbit.
Like only Sunday brunch, or like regular is different for different people, right?
Right.
So maybe be a little more specific, and then same with nutritious. I think that also this one is maybe just a dumpster question, because like, how do you really quantify what nutrition is, right? And then even if you say like a nutritious breakfast is something that's like X amount of calories with X amount of vitamins or whatever, right? Like, then I'm gonna be thinking back, and I'm gonna like answering this question, be like, what is in toast? Like I don't
Right.
know what, I'm not gonna know off my head how nutritious my breakfast is.
Sure. Right. It's a little bit ambiguous, and defining a nutritious breakfast is going to be challenging because it could be a lot of things, right? Leftovers could potentially be nutritious, as could eggs and
Yeah,
bacon.
and then even if you break it down and make it more specific, then you still are left with the question of like, I don't remember what I ate or what it had in it, or like, what is how many calories are in the jam that I put on my toast versus like all of these other things. Right?
Sure.
Like, it's just a difficult one for us to say.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I guess you're depending on what people's self-definition of nutritious is, which may not tell you a whole lot. Okay. Yeah, and I think splitting this into 2 questions, probably makes some sense too. Like, I regularly eat breakfast being one question, and then my breakfasts are, I try to eat a nutritious or a balanced breakfast or something like that. Could be a second question. Fixing kind of nutritious or balanced a little bit with some nuance could help. Okay. Yeah, Brian.
I kind of to piggyback off of what my peer was saying, maybe like a way to measure nutrition could be like food groups maybe, and like the caloric, like the calories that go into like how much of each section you have maybe, but.
Which, I mean, potentially that could strain people's memories as well, right? Because it's like, oh, okay, this is what I had today. What did I have yesterday? Or Yeah, Theodora.
Assuming that you can find it by the food groups, what if someone's lactose intolerant? Well, I guess you could have some.
You could, I guess, have milk or milk alternatives as a category, right? I mean, the food groups themselves are weirdly problematic too, because, you know, we all bought in childhood to that Canada Food Guide propaganda, which made us all eat the wrong things. You know, I know you had your hand up. I don't think I
Oh, it was covered.
covered. Okay, yeah, please.
If you did like a question like this potentially for a study, would the proper way to go about this would be maybe to like give them a food journal or something like this, and then the investigator would then decide, or
That's smart.
then they would decide what is and what's not and put it into.
I like that. Food journal could be a really good way to go about it. Yeah, so you would like. I have this on another slide. You've defeated me and gotten ahead of me. But no, diaries and journals are really interesting and would be a really interesting way of kind of approaching a question like this. Instead of kind of relying on someone's self perception of nutrition or healthy breakfast, you just see if you can get them to log their breakfasts for a week, right? And then you make the determination as the researcher what that looked like, right? Can be a little harder to recruit for because people might not want to do something for 7 days, right? But it's a really good, that would be a really interesting and a really good approach to it. It'd be smart. That's a smart operationalization. Okay. Any other thoughts on this before I consign it to the dumpster of history? No? Okay. What is your opinion of the University of Alberta? Very good, neutral. Joan, which one?
Very poor.
Very poor. I'm sorry to hear that your experience here hasn't been good. Notice I didn't ask about myself as a professor because I don't want to know. Until months later when you guys are done the class, then I can know that you hated me, and that's fine.
But I'm serious, who or is the question being asked to?
Oh, I don't know. Let's just say it's students, like, or it could be anybody, right? Let's say student or the random public, right? Someone who lives in Edmonton.
I guess that would kind of be a problem because even if it was only asked for students, like we also asked students for first years who just came, and like people who like first year undergraduates and like graduate students who've been here for years. Like I feel like I feel like your opinion of the University of Alberta
Gets worse the longer you're here.
so yeah.
Imagine me.
Yeah, but,
I first came here in 2001.
I was important.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I started my undergrad here in 2001. And then I took a long time before I came back, but nevertheless. Imagine how bad it is for me. Caitlin.
It's too vague. Like, it's hard to give just a blanket opinion of, I think the university is good, because, like, what are you talking about? Are you asking about, like, curriculum? Are you asking about peer support? Are you asking about if the lunch is good? Are you asking about, like,
The housing
have a
option.
good reputation, so on and so forth, right? It's just not specific enough to get a useful answer.
Okay. Yeah, it's very vague, right? Your opinion, like the university being sort of a vast thing, your opinion of it in what way, right? That's a good observation. Yeah, Brian, is that what you were going to say too?
Caitlin.
Okay, perfect. All right. Good. You did good. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's jump back into some rules, and then we'll see where we get for survey questions today. All right. Another type of question, right? And one that I use a lot on, actually, like not for surveys, but on exams. But hopefully you can kind of understand what something like this would look like. One of the really popular things that a lot of survey companies use is vignette questions, right? And basically, vignette questions are questions that present someone with a scenario and ask them how they would respond, right? There's an aspect of this sometimes in public polling. I'm trying to remember what it is called. Sometimes you're trying with a vignette question to try and detach the person from their immediate circumstances. And sometimes this helps to get a more honest answer from people, right? There's a kind of version of this. It's not really a vignette question, but it's referred to in like if you're trying to do opinion polling and get away from like social desirability bias. And vignette questions are good for that too, which is called the neighbor question, right? This popped up in 2016, in the 2016 election in the United States, right? The one where Donald Trump became president somehow. If you remember, I know you were probably, it's a while back, you were much younger then. But one of the things that happened back in 2016 was that almost none of the pollsters predicted that Donald Trump would win, right? Because there was such a kind of social desirability bias against Donald Trump that a lot of people answered that they really didn't like Trump, even if they were actually planning on voting for Donald Trump. The one pollster that got it right and predicted actually that he thought Donald Trump was going to win because he thought he was leading in all of the swing states, got to that result by using what's called a neighbor question. And so in a neighbor question, instead of asking, what do you think about something, or who are you going to vote for in the coming election, if you suspect social desirability bias might play a role, you ask, who do you think your neighbor will vote for, right? And basically the idea is you might not answer kind of honestly about yourself if it's a kind of, uncomfortable thing or socially undesirable kind of way of answering, but you're much more likely to answer truthfully about someone else, right? So if you think your neighbor, and people tend to live in pretty homogenous neighborhoods, might vote for Donald Trump or whoever, right? You might answer that one honestly, but you're really more thinking about yourself, right? So the person who used the neighbor question got actually the prediction more or less right and was a lot closer. Vignette questions is kind of the same idea, right? You want to put kind of a story out there, right? A little scenario, asking people how they would respond. And basically you can anchor, people in a real scenario, but creates a distance, right? So if you wanted to know, say, on like a hot button social issue, right? Trying to think something like abortion, right? If you wanted to ask, like, if someone would have an abortion if they found out that, their child had Down syndrome, there might be a degree of social desirability bias where people don't want to admit that they would, abort a child with Down syndrome. But if you kind of, set up the scenarios like, Sarah finds out she's pregnant, at her, I can't remember, 12-week ultrasound, right? The doctor discovers that Sarah, this baby has Down syndrome. What should Sarah do, right? And, it's not a perfect way of formulating it. But in that scenario, right, someone who might otherwise, if it was about themselves, be like, well, I could never, get an abortion. They might answer on Sarah's behalf that Sarah should get an abortion. So you sometimes get a greater degree of honesty with a kind of vignette question, right? And especially when you phrase it about, say, another person, right? So you're not talking about you, you're talking about some other person. You sometimes get more honesty in a sort of vignette question, right? You can do you see this again in public opinion polling sometimes, right? The idea that, Sarah is thinking about who she should vote for in the next election. These are her characteristics. Who should she vote for, right? And someone might say Donald Trump, even though they'd be too ashamed to say that they themselves might vote for, say, Donald Trump, right? So hopefully the answers are more candid, just because you create that distance between yourself and the response that you're giving. You're not talking about yourself, you're talking about Sarah or someone else. And so it creates that space and it can actually give more honest answers in a lot of cases. In terms of weaknesses, right, when you abstract it out, people may say something quite different than what they might do in real life, right? You can get the scenario where someone answers in the way that they do think someone should act, even though they would act differently in their own life. Should you return the wallet, right? You might keep the wallet, but you would say that Sarah should return the wallet she found that contains $1,000, right? You'd be like, yeah, Sarah should return that. That belongs to someone else, but they would actually keep it. So the distance can be good. Sometimes people answer more honestly, but sometimes they don't, and it depends on how the scenario is constructed. On the abortion question, right? They might, give you an idealized version. No, they shouldn't, but they themselves would actually say get an abortion in that case. So it might give you ideals like how people perceive how society should be as well. So they can be useful. You have to construct them really carefully. I like the neighbor question more. How do you think? What do you think your neighbor would do? I think it's a useful one. Sorry, does that make sense? Okay. All right. So maybe I'll turn that. I should have put this on that. I occasionally forget that I should always put things on high contrast backgrounds. Sometimes I get too fancy with the designs. This one looked pretty when Microsoft suggested it to me. Okay, yeah, so one of the things that people often do, and I think is really useful, is if you're going to do a survey, right, you're going to send it out into the world, it's useful to run a pilot study. Pilot study can be a lot of things, right? It can be, you send it out to a small group, just to kind of test the questions. Generally, pilot studies, right, you want to make sure that your questions are working the way that you want them to, right? And basically that they're being interpreted properly, because sometimes in writing questions, you think it's very clear, and then it turns out not to be very clear at all, right? So, yeah, you want to check if it works well. Potentially, right, I talked about this with open questions. You can send out a pilot study sometimes with open questions, just especially if you're in a field where you don't know what you don't know, right? So you want to kind of get a lay of the land. You can send out a pilot study with open questions to sort of generate raw data, which you can then use to create closed questions for a bigger survey. A lot of people, will do pilot studies to test basically an instrument, right? So you want to basically, get experience administering the instrument. A lot of people do this by role playing though. Like this is like the one that we're doing, which we're taking, like I'm not actually administering it, but I'm part of the project in an administrative capacity. I'm not going to the prisons to do it. But the one that's being done by the CCR right now in prisons in Alberta, they've been piloting it for probably 2 months. And every Thursday they get together and they role play, right? One person role plays as an incarcerated person and the other person does the interviewer. So you get to test the questions, you get to see where problems come up, you get to see the length of the instrument or of the survey, which is an important thing as well. And you get experience kind of asking the questions and seeing how it goes. But sometimes people do this by just taking it out in the field and trying it out and seeing what kind of results you get, and often just throwing out those results. But you get a sense of how your tool is working and whether you need to make changes. You can you can use it to test if you're getting variability, right? This is a test of your question's effectiveness, right? Whether everybody's answering in one particular direction. That's not a very useful question. Embarrassing or uninteresting questions can be taken out. And questions that are difficult to understand, right? If the wording's weird or it's jargony, you can take those out as well. Any instructions that are on there, and whether there's a satisfactory flow, right? Whether it kind of moves along in a satisfactory way and people can complete it in a reasonably good way. Sometimes you pilot stuff, honestly, you get your parents and your friends to take your survey and try to answer it as best they can just to see if it works, right? I did this when I did a study. I think I basically distributed it amongst the staff where I was working, and then asked them to distribute it to a few friends. And basically we were just testing it to see if the instrument worked. And from there, we took out some questions and made some changes. Okay, this one I want to stress is very useful. And this, especially when it comes to your major labs, right? Or when it comes to kind of designing your survey questions for the mini lab, this is a really useful strategy. And basically, I think one of the best ways, especially for concepts that have already been studied in great detail, is to use existing question sets, right? There's a lot of surveys floating around out there, right? There's a ton, there's a ton of things that you can compare if you use the same kind of questions. And I mentioned some of these earlier, right? That basically, if you're trying to figure out a particular concept, sometimes it doesn't make sense to come up with your own questions, right? Sometimes it really would make more sense to just take a tool that someone's already refined over time and basically just use that, right? Just use it. You can cite it. A lot of these tools are widely available, and you could just use them to do evaluation, especially of things that are really kind of touchy and difficult, technical, right? Things that have a technical definition that you want to do. You can use these kinds of existing question sets, right? So I'm thinking here of concepts, things like loneliness, right? Things like depression, things like, if you want to measure ADHD, agreeableness, right? Personality traits. All of these things exist out there in kind of question sets that you can ultimately find, right? So this one, basically these are 3 out of 9 questions, right? That I took out of what's called the PAQ 9, right? And this is a way of measuring depression, right? And this is just a web version of it, but you can go and kind of download a PDF of PAC 9. And you can administer this as part of if you wanted to, let's say you were wanting to talk about social media use and depression amongst teenagers, right? How are you going to get a read of, or how are you going to operationalize depression? My advice is to go to something like PAC 9, right? And there's lots of different depression scales you can find. And honestly, if you're looking for it, you can go to Google and be like, depression measurement scale, right? And it'll kick out a bunch of results. PAQ 9 comes up most frequently, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. And basically, you can integrate those questions and whatever measurement tool they have in there. It's usually a score, right? Into your own survey so that you then get a really objective way of measuring something like, say, depression, right? And again, especially at kind of you can modify them if you need to, but especially at kind of the starting out level of coming up with survey questions, it's not always easy, right? And figuring out how to operationalize a really complicated concept like loneliness or depression can be really difficult. And the stumbling block that I see most often with students trying to put this together is they end up asking the right kinds of questions, but in ways that aren't exhaustive of the concept, right? So to ask, something like depression, right? On a scale of 1 to 5, how depressed are you right now, right? And I've seen that kind of articulation. And it's not necessarily bad, right? It makes sense to sort of ask people to self-rate on a scale of 1 to 5, but there are better, more objective ways of measuring things like depression, right? And you can see, right, this is a psychological scale, right? And this asks, I cut off the top, but basically in the last 2 weeks, how often have you felt the following, right? So little interest or pleasure in doing things, right? And it basically, if you answer not at all, you get a score of 0. If you answer several days, you get a score of 1. More than half the days, a score of 2 and 3. And when you get to the bottom of the 9 questions, right, you come up with a total score out of 27, right? And the higher you get, the closer you get to 27, the more depressed you are. I don't know who would be calling me from Langley. I'm going to assume that's a telemarketer. And right, so then you basically, yeah, please go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to say, how would you cite something like that? Say you were using the same 3 consecutive questions or 9 questions or whatever. Would you put a citation on each, or just cite at the end of your survey questions 3, 6, and 9 were from this scale, or something like that? How would you go?
Yeah, so in your write-up, right? So when you do the, not in your survey itself, let's say in our assignment here, you would just cite it, probably, I would put it as a footnote, in like your section where you talk about operationalization, you know, you're going to be using, I can't remember who the PAC-9 scale author is. Let's say Johnson. I'm using Johnson's, you know, PAC-9 scale to measure depression, right? And then you just put that in, you know.
But it wouldn't be like directly in the survey, right? Like you took this question.
No, it would be more like for academic purposes when you go to report your findings, right? And you write up your book on whatever it is, or your journal article. Then you say, you know, in your methodology section, you write, you know, your methodology section, you know, we use the, you know, a select of the questions from the PAC-9 scale, or Johnson's PAC-9 scale, and then you cite it in the works cited for that area, right? So, but no, like if you were, as you're administering it, it's not relevant to the people taking it that they know that you got it from here, right? It's more just acknowledging it, yeah, in your methodology section. I suppose, in theory, it's an interesting question. If you're, you know, in your information and consent letter, you could put it there that you're using, you know, we're going to ask you a bunch of questions, survey questions. Some of them are taken from the UCLA loneliness scale. You could put it there. I don't think it's necessary because, again, you know, people taking your survey are not generally that interested in where the questions came from. But you could put it there just to, you know, cross your T's and dot your I's. I'm like, which letter is dotted? Which letter is crossed? I can't remember now. But yeah, I highly recommend this. Now, this makes operationalization, by the way, a snap, right? Because when it comes to, you know, your operational, I know this would have been useful information last night. I'm sorry, didn't quite make it. This does make operationalization a snap because when it comes to giving your operational definition, right? You say, I'm going to operationalize the concept of depression by administering the 9 questions from the PAC-9 depression scale, right? And that is a perfectly legitimate operationalization, right? You're telling, you know, whoever, me or Joe, how you're going to measure this particular concept, basically by saying, I'm using this existing tool, these are the questions I'm going to ask, this is how I'm operationalizing it. So highly, highly recommend, especially like, again, there's a ton of these out there, and there's I don't want to say a billion. There's lots of well-recognized tools that you can use to measure different phenomena, right? Especially when you're talking about people, you know, things like depression, loneliness, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, right? Anything that you different kinds of neurodivergence, anything that you can think of, well, maybe not, but most things you can think of are going to have existing scales that are going to be used in a diagnostic way. Now, I mean, the one thing you can't then do is report back to people like, wow, based on how you answered this survey, you have ADHD, right? That's something you can use internally. You can't, because you're not a clinician, you can't diagnose it. But you can say from a sociological perspective, right, this unit or this element of my study, right, this person, you know, scored, you know, 20 on the depression scale. So I think this person probably has depression. So then you can talk about, you know, how many people had depression, how many hours they use social media for, or whatever it is you're studying. But you couldn't use it in a diagnostic way to contact someone and then be like, hey, just so you know, you score, you know, you don't want to give them whatever this score is, right, in a diagnostic way, because you're not a clinician, and that is something that they should pursue clinically if they want to. But it's not something that you're not supposed to report back to them as individuals. So yeah, please.
Isn't it unethical to do that? Like, isn't it unethical to, like, if you know someone has something or like something wrong with them, to not like tell them or help them out if you're the investigator?
So most of the time these surveys are done anonymously, right? It's very rare that you would have personal information gathered because that would create ethical problems as well. But you wouldn't want to like give them the score because it should be administered by, you know, a clinician in some way, and you're not, right? So it'd be unethical for you to give them, you know, at the end, come to the end of your PAC-2 section, be like, you scored 26, like you're a BuzzFeed quiz or something, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's not in a clinical scenario. You're using it for a different purpose, and because you're not qualified to do that, you shouldn't. They should be, you know, they should be seeking help, but you're not qualified to do it, and you're not. I mean, because it's also the information's being gathered, you know, typically anonymously, so you wouldn't have that option, and you shouldn't be collecting that information for the most part, right? It should be anonymous. But yeah, I don't think it's unethical in this case because you're giving it more for research purposes than for diagnostic purposes. And you really would not want to attempt diagnosis, again, if you're not in contact with the person as in a kind of doctor-patient scenario. So, but I understand the point. You're like, what if they do score 27 on the depression scale? Like, isn't that something they should know? But it's not something that as a social researcher, right, you should be intervening in that way. Yeah, Caitlin.
I feel like if you're a 27 on the depression scale, you already know.
Probably, yes. I'm obviously, that's a little bit of hyperbole, right? But if they're like, I don't know, say borderline, right? Whatever the borderline is, they're at a 16. I don't actually know what the borderline on the PAC-9 is. You know, because you're not in a clinical role, you're using it for research purposes, not clinical purposes. And I think that's, you wouldn't want to cross that line. Yeah.
Would it be okay, like, what if they show some really, like, concerning things about, like, where you think they might be a risk to themselves or others, like, then can you say anything, or, like, can you, especially if it's anonymous, like, would you, like, once it's anonymous, you can't, like, connect them at all, like, there's no way.
Okay, so as we're thinking about this is an interesting question. I'm thinking of like an online survey where you're not gathering like personal information. As it turns out, right? Sorry, because I'm involved in this study, and this, I'm kind of on the periphery of it. If you're doing, say, like a structured interview, right? You might, this is possible, in a structured interview scenario, if someone expresses what you think is concerning, you could point them to resources, right? Like you as a researcher, again, you're not going to be in a position to like actually help people. So what I know what our team is doing is if they, if someone expresses that they might harm themselves or they're considering suicide, we report it back to our boss right away, right? So it goes up the chain, and we have a WhatsApp chat that's like, hey, I encountered this person. What do I do? And the other thing is we have cards, right? Basically like with, suicide prevention and other, help lines that are manned by professionals that we can give them as kind of referrals. That is as far as I think we're allowed to go. And part of that is we're also going into prisons, which is a really odd scenario that's very controlled. And the prison staff don't always love us as researchers that we're there and talking to people that are incarcerated. They're a little suspicious. But yeah, I mean, if, you could have kind of information for people who think they might be depressed or might show concerning signs, that you kind of give, like, again, a referral in the sense of like a number they can call, right? Like the suicide hotline or something. I know that's what Sandra's doing in this study. It's like, okay, if we see people who are in distress, like we can make those referrals. I think that works in like a structured interview or say, a phone interview scenario. Obviously, I was thinking online because that's the kind of stuff I've done because I like to be more hands-off. In those scenarios, definitely, if you heard something that's concerning, like, if one of the questions is, I feel like killing myself, right? I don't think that's a PAC-9 question. It's a little too direct. But if it was, and they answered, nearly every day, you could offer that information. Again, I think that's as far as you can go, especially if you're not a clinician and you're not, okay. Now, so you're asking hard questions, which is good. If it's a minor, if you happen to be interviewing a minor, which has a whole bunch of complexities, because you would have had to get consent from obviously whoever their parent is. If you're in that scenario where you're dealing with minors, then you're in a scenario of duty to report, right? Then you have to tell social services or whoever's responsible for them, the proper authorities. But that would be, again, only a case, I think, when you're dealing with a minor or a vulnerable, like an adult that's a vulnerable person, say someone with a disability that you find out is being abused or is suicidal or something. Yeah, then you do have a duty to report. With adults, it's a little bit different. Yeah, Joan.
What if
Oh my God, what if scenario? This is like the criminology class I used to teach where people would bring me these like obscure legal questions
Okay, two questions.
I always hated those questions.
Okay, first of all, what if like the survey was like the dogs, the person asked for their results, do you give it to them, or?
That would be highly unusual, right? I mean, generally the data is anonymized for the most part. Like even in a structured interview, if you're doing it correctly, you're anonymizing the data in some way. So it would be unusual. I guess if you're using an evaluative tool, yeah, that's a question for research ethics, honestly. Like you'd have to probably go back to the research ethics board and see what they say. Because I'll be honest, I don't know. That's never something that occurred to me to think of whether if someone asks for their results. Because I'm just thinking of it as a pure social science data, but that's an interesting question.
Yeah, and also, what if like in like the at-risk minor, what if they ask not to have their results like
You have a duty. Like the duty to report is pretty inflexible. Or like if they ask for their results not to be included, is that?
Well, like what if they ask for like their results not to be told like to their guardian? Maybe.
Well, I mean, you don't have to tell their guardian, but you would have to tell like someone, right? Like proper authority, social worker, social services. Like there's always like a chain of who you report to in given circumstances. Obviously, if they're afraid that they might be harmed by, say, a guardian because they're being abused, right, then you go to Child Protective Services. There's going to be proper authorities that you have to figure out who you're reporting to, right? The police, like, you know, in cases of, say, sexual abuse, you may just have to go to the police, right? But even if someone like a minor asks you, hey, please don't tell anyone, you know, that my dad hits me because they'll take me away. You still have a duty to report, right? You still have to report it regardless of, because the imminent concern is the protection of the individual, not, you know, the protection of their family unit. That's a separate problem. But you have to tell, or I think you can be legally liable if you withheld that information. Again, that's probably never a circumstance in terms of like structured interviews that you're going to run into unless you're doing it with really vulnerable populations and asking some pretty personal questions. It's highly unlikely that you would run into this sort of scenario. But yeah, especially with minors, you know, the duty to report, you open yourself up to a bunch of liability if you conceal something. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just gonna say it might be enough to just disclose like, hey, you know, like maybe in the consent form or something, like, hey, we're using the PAC-9 scale, and then if you want to explore that further, like, take it yourself online or whatever, tally up your own marks, and then you know. Or maybe something like, if you're getting into sensitive material, just have like, as a disclaimer or whatever, just like these results like will not be revealed to you, but like, if you do feel suicidal, here's a number you can call, or if you have been a victim of sexual abuse, here's a number you can call, or whatever, just like code that right in so people don't have that, and you don't have to tell anyone.
Yeah, and like in your information and consent letter and a kind of header warning for a section. That's a theory. Yeah, that's a possible thing. And again, like if you're dealing with sensitive information, you know, when we talked about ethics, you do have to disclose like similarly to what a psychologist would do, right? If I hear that you're suicidal or, you know, being harmed or abused in some way, you know, I do have a duty to report. You know, all those caveats, again, should be done at the beginning so people know that it's a possibility. I mean, even if that affects how they might answer, right? But yeah, especially, yeah, there's not a lot. See, I know this mostly in volunteer scenarios, like duty to report is like if you don't do it, you can be held criminally liable if something happens, right? So it's not something you would want to mess around with if you suspect, right, that there's something going on. But I had not considered this. I say this, in SOC, what was it? SOC 321, Youth Crime and Society, I used to get these kinds of really in-depth legal questions. It's like, if someone murders someone 5 minutes before they turn 18, are they charged as a minor or an adult? What's that?
Depends on where they are, because like if the murder is a crime, it's like it's not some minors can be charged as adults.
Yeah, these are questions that lawyers can answer, and I was like, let me go read the statute again, and I'll get back to you. Anyway, I hated those questions in SOS 321 because they were like, I'm not a lawyer. I never wanted to be a lawyer. I specifically am a sociologist because I didn't want to be a lawyer, amongst other things. Yeah, Caitlin.
Just a thought, I don't know, contributing to the conversation, but it's not really a question. When I was in high school, a kid who I went to school with, we were still minors, it was like days after we graduated, did a murder. And like, had been planning it for a while because like his dad was abusive and he decided he couldn't live like that. And he had like asked the school janitor, like, what's the best way to dispose of a body?
Okay.
And
Wow.
then she reported it to the school board, like, I guess she felt she had the duty to report. And the school board just went like, that's just teenagers being weird, and they did nothing about it. And then he like actually went through with it and did a murder, and she was like, hey, well, like, I reported it, and it just ended up being like a big weird thing where they were all like, well, but like, how are we supposed to know that that was for real, you know? I guess just kind of wondering, like, where does the duty to report stop? Like, if you're like, this is just like a dumb high school kid and he's not gonna do anything, like, do you still?
I mean, in that case, the janitor definitely did the right thing, and the person was out of school or still in school at that.
Like, when he asked her, we were in school, and then the murder happened, I think, like 4 days after school let out or something like that.
Yeah, I feel like the school really should have followed up with this student just to assess, right? Or, passed it on to relevant authorities, right? Like police, and be like, I know there's also a thing you don't want, like school to prison pipeline and all of these things. If the janitor thought the person was serious, right, enough to report it, it's definitely something that should be followed up on, right? Because, I mean, what's worse?
But like, who gets to make that call, right? Like, if the janitor had been the one who went like, I don't think this is serious, right? Then they would face the liability. And if the janitor's like, I don't think this is serious, but I'm gonna report it anyway, just to like get them off my case, right? Like, where does that end? Like, are you?
Yeah, I mean, now we're into a technical legal question, which I just told you I hate. I mean, to me, it's whoever like didn't report and didn't follow up the next chain of kind of not chain of custody, but up the authority ladder. Who should be following up on that? Like, even if the principal is just calling the kid in to the principal's office to assess, like, hey, you said this to the janitor, like, is everything okay? Right? Not following up on it at all and just being like, boys will be boys or girls will be girls or whatever. In this case, to me, seems like negligence, because it's like if someone tells you that they have a suicide plan, right? That is a good sign that you should be following up and probably reporting it. Same thing if someone has a murder plan and they're like, how do I get rid of a body? That seems like a pretty obvious red flag that this person is either serious or distressed in some way, and that should have been, to my mind, followed up on. And it's probably, the janitor does the right thing by going to, someone with more competence than them and assessing, chain of liability and criminality in that case, or worry about the individual. And then that the school administration doesn't follow up on it, that sits on them, right? That they had fair warning, they were told. Now, I mean, in this case, if you ever suspect something like this, make sure that you put it in writing, right? In your email, and be like, hey, I just following up on that meeting we just had where I told you that Joe is maybe planning on killing their father because they asked me specifically for advice on how to get rid of a body. I just wanted to, confirm that, you've understood everything, because you wouldn't want someone being like, oh, well, they weren't very clear about it, right? So if you are in a situation where you are worried someone might not follow up on it, having it in writing to cover your own liability. The janitor also could have called the police, right? Or social services directly, right? Anybody can phone. So if you suspect, you don't have to defer to authority. In this case, they did the right thing and wasn't followed up on. they probably trusted that the school administration would deal with it in an appropriate way. They're definitely not liable in that case. It would be the principal, who didn't follow proper procedure, or the counselor, or whoever, vice principal, or whoever it was.
Yeah, I don't know, like, just for me, that is such a, like, a teenage boy would ask that question just as a joke, you know? So like, if you think like, whatever, like this kid's just joking around and you make the wrong call, like, are you, like, how much, I don't know, this is a really weirdly specific situation.
It is yeah.
Isn't necessarily survey relevant.
If you like if you ask your janitor like how to dispose of your body as a joke, you deserve whatever consequence happens. That's not something to joke about. Like I don't care if they're teenage boys. They're not stupid.
Yeah, there are certain things that probably shouldn't be joked about, and like you shouldn't joke about bringing a gun to school or hijacking an airplane because you're just asking for trouble. I think it kind of falls in the same category, but yeah, especially if someone was made aware of it, they should follow up. Just, again, it doesn't have to be legal, but there should be a conversation there. In that case, like, so you said this to, the janitor. Is everything okay? Like, and then you can assess, right? Because, at least then you get, like, is it boys will be boys, which is a stupid thing, obviously. But yeah, is it just curiosity? But yeah, again, that seems like a weirdly specific thing to ask. No more technical legal questions. Just no, it's a good question. But I will say this is my least favorite thing about criminology was that people seem to assume criminologists are also like legal experts. And we read some case law, but not to the depth of like a lawyer, right? And that would be something for, criminal law to determine liability or even civil law. Because potentially survivors could sue the school for not having reported correctly, right? So, anyway, What's that?
How early are we leaving?
I don't know. How many slides do we have left? This whole thing kind of got off on a funny footing. All right. Well, maybe we'll go forward. This is like the best back and forth I've ever had in Intro to Social Methods. By the way, you guys are awesome. Okay. Questionnaires. Let's just punch through. Hang on. How many slides do I have left? I'm going to discard. I was just going to see. What? I have 11 slides left? Oh, that's so many. Okay. My back is so sore. Let's do a couple more because I feel, let's go till 3:10. We'll go till 3:10 and I'll let you go. And I'll go like buy some Robaxa set and drive home. I'm sure that's perfectly safe. Okay, questionnaires, right? So questionnaires, a structured interview without an interviewer. I just use the word surveys, right? Typically, these are administered, filling out a form of some kind. The most common one today is online because people read the questions without the interviewer. They typically have to be very easy to follow. And increasingly, right, this is where everything is moving because it's so cheap, right? Compared to sending people out in the field for days at a time. Unless, like my boss, you have an army of graduate students who are relatively cheap labor. Okay. Compared to interviews, right, questionnaires or like text surveys tend to have few open questions because closed questions are easier for people to answer. There's less less people jumping out of it because it's taking too long and they don't want to fill out all these boxes. So they tend to be closed questions. Most online surveys are this format. The simple designs to respond to complete all the sections without difficulty tend to have pretty good flow and logic and all that fun stuff. And they tend to be short. Like the typical length of a survey is under half an hour of this kind of questionnaire / survey is under half an hour to complete. Because beyond that, people get frustrated. And who's got the time to fill out like a 2-hour survey? Okay, so what are the advantages of, say, oh, okay, sure. You forgot it. All good. No worries. Okay. I wonder how long. I feel bad. Has she been waiting out there for like 15 minutes because this class is the weird length for a Monday, Wednesday class. I feel bad. I feel really bad. Okay. She's like, I just want to go home. Why isn't their class ending? Strangely, the same thing you're thinking, Joe. I just want to go home. Why isn't this class ending? All right. Yeah. So what's the advantage to questionnaires? They are cheap, right? More convenient to do. I mean, when I did a survey. We did 500 on one, and then 1,500 Edmontonians in another, and it was done through an online survey portal, which I think was LegerWeb, if I remember. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's too much detail. Who cares? I had the results in 8 days, right? Basically, the survey ran for 8 days, and then it was complete, and I had all of the data within 12 days, basically, sent to me by the portal, and it was all organized and beautiful. Compared to that, right, if I had done 1,500 structured interviews by phone or in person, it would have taken months, right? It's an incredibly slow process. By outsourcing it, and it would have been much more expensive. We looked at all of these options, and we went with the online one. I think it cost me for 1,500 it was $10,000 roughly, and we looked at like a phone interview from I can't remember which company it was, and it would have cost about $50,000 to do it by phone because you had to have actual people making phone calls and trying to get a hold of people. So they are a lot cheaper. They are a lot quicker. No interviewer effect, right? Basically, people fill them out themselves, and while they make mistakes, there's nothing where, talking to a person doesn't cause a reactive effect in this case, right? So less social desirability bias. And, people, they're filling it out themselves, so there's no interviewer misunderstanding what's going on. And then, so social desirability bias, especially with written surveys, seems to be much reduced because people feel better about giving answers to a blank, to a text rather than to a person on even sensitive questions. So there is that. Okay. Yeah, disadvantages of kind of questionnaires in general. You can't explain the question, right? So if there's a misunderstanding, the person may answer incorrectly. The second one, right, greater risk of missing data because of the lack of probing or supervision. This usually, this would have been a problem with, say, paper and pen surveys, more so than people get very impatient and then they won't finish the survey. And open questions are really hard because, a lot of people don't want to write a lot, right? And so, I've had open boxes in these kinds of surveys, and I'll get like 2-word answers. They're not very useful. People will tend to not want to answer like long box questions. You'll get 2 words in it, or they'll get annoyed and just quit the survey, right? Or if it's not appropriate for everybody. Definitely if you have people who maybe have learning disabilities, it can be really difficult to do these kinds. So you may be excluding populations where English is maybe a second or additional language. Designated respondents may not have completed the questionnaire. And especially when we get to like random sampling, you'll see where non-response ends up being a problem. Web surveys. Web surveys are just increasingly, and I think I took out a slide that's email surveys because I haven't seen one in a really long time. Web surveys are really, really becoming popular, and you have like all of the big polling firms now, whether it's Angus Reid, Ipsos, Abacus, Leger, and there's a few others in Canada. I can't remember what they're all called. They've essentially all gone to these web panels, right? Even, a company in the US like Pew that used to do everything by phone, they've shifted to web surveys for everything. Basically respondents go to websites to complete the questionnaire. And it's easy, right? It's attractive. They often have like a really attractive appearance. They're user-friendly. You can't skip questions, right? There's drop-down menus. Or like little boxes to check for whatever you have. It's really becoming the standard because there's really no other way to do it anymore. People don't answer the phone. People don't answer mail surveys or any of these kinds of things. Oh, and the greatest thing ever, you can just, all the software, like even if you do something through SurveyMonkey, you can download it as, say, a file straight to R or SPSS or Python. in the right format. So everything is already there and the code book is already set. So everything is kind of, generally beautiful. I mean, there are problems with web surveys today. Like I said, dominated by a few big companies, and most of them have panels, basically people who have signed up to use those platforms. And so sometimes you get these same people answering multiple surveys from, say, Abacus or Leger. So they can be seen as flawed, but increasingly there's just no other way to do it. Okay, I said I was going to let you go at 3:10, and frankly, my back is killing me. So why don't we'll stop it there. We'll finish surveys on, and again, we're like a whole half a week ahead of schedule. So your discussion today and helped us slow down and get back on schedule in a way. So yeah, we'll finish surveys on Wednesday, and then we'll start in on probability sampling and give you an idea of that. And then like the next lab, whenever it is, it's not tomorrow. Tomorrow there is no lab tomorrow. But the week after there is a lab again, right? And that'll be surveys, right? So we're well ahead of where I thought we would be, which is perfect. Yeah, please. Oh, I just haven't changed it yet because I rearranged the schedule. I changed Mini Lab too. I'm always a little behind the ball because I live day to day. That's how I live. I'm always in the moment or something. But yeah, I will make sure to send out that there's no lab tomorrow so everyone knows. Okay, I'll do that before I go home. All right, you're free. Joan, you can leave now. I know you've been itching to leave this whole time. I'm kidding, I'm just teasing. Oh, even if it's a little true.
Questions?
Yes.
I don't know if
So
they're very...
what is your name?
Maria.
Maria, okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
What are your questions, Maria?
So I don't know if they have too much to do with the actual material, but I've always just kind of wondered them. So you mentioned that you getting questions done or getting data there essentially in a fast manner is a good thing. So is that because per publication you get paid or?
No, definitely not. You get paid nothing for publications unless it's a book, right? I mean, I think it's more about time and resources, right? Mm-hmm. The faster you have your data, the faster you can start working with your data, rather than spending, you can get it done in 8 days and get your data and start working on it. If you're doing it for a client, right, you can get them their data a lot faster, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. If you are wanting to write an article or do your dissertation or your master's thesis, the faster you get data, obviously the quicker you can start working with it. And also the longer things take, the more they tend to cost, right? And always, especially in academic research, you're going to be dealing with limited budgets, right? Mm-hmm. You're maybe you have a funder and you have X amount of money they're willing to spend on survey research, or you've got a SHIRT grant, right? And you're needing to use that for research. But yeah, the faster you get it, the faster you can start working with it, which means, the quicker you can, if you're doing a master's or PhD, graduate. If you're in a situation where you are, a faculty member, you can publish more, right? Which helps you with things like promotion and tenure and all of that stuff, right? And just simplifies the process massively.
Does an interview cost money to hold an interview, or?
I mean, if you're doing it yourself, no. But if you're paying someone to do it, then yeah, right? And most of the time, if you're going to get a reasonable, if you're talking about qualitative interviewing, most people will do that themselves or within a small team. When you're talking quantitative, because you're talking about so many,
yeah,
if you're talking 400 or 500, you need a team, right? You ultimately are going to need a group of people working on it, which means, you have to pay them, even if they're grad students. Grad students don't get paid much, but they still get paid. So
I actually didn't even know that they got paid till I think I asked my TA in October if she was getting paid, and then
I hope the
first
answer is
found out.
yes.
Yeah, she said yes. So
yeah, it's not always. I mean,
she said she was very little, but yes.
It's not always a lot, right? It's like for a course like this, I think it's they get paid $6,000 for TAing the course.
Okay.
Which is why I try to, when I have TAs, try to get them to do as little as possible, because I feel like that's exploitation wages.
Yeah.
But yeah, it They do get paid, and it depends on where. I think it's like $17 an hour or $18 an hour, so it's not always very much. But
And then also so basically, like, I know that you were saying how you don't have to disclose back to the participant about their results, or like it could be even like bad if you do that, or
yeah, I mean, and it's generally a kind of a blind process, right? You're not supposed to know who they are.
That's true.
So contacting them and being like, hey, by the way, you scored high for depression.
yeah,
You know, and it would also, I mean, it could affect the, like, in a certain scenario, right? Let's say you're doing it in a web survey, they do that section of it, and then you want to ask them a few more questions after that. If you tell them, wow, you scored high on our depression scale, ultimately, like, you could be affecting the results of that next portion as
That's
well,
true.
right? So it can affect, like, it can cause a sort of reactive effect. If you're like, wow, you scored 98 percentile for depression, you should go see a doctor and immediately seek help. Again, a little different if you're doing, like, structured, like, in-person kind of a questionnaire or
Yeah,
a survey, you know, because then you're interacting with a real person, and if you see them in distress, right, then, you know, you want to do what you can to help them. And again, it's different for adults, right? With adults, mostly you're just going to be like, okay, unless they're, like, vulnerable, say disabled or elderly in some way, and then there might be legal authorities you want to contact. But for, like, a normal adult, right, you'd probably be like, well, at the end of our survey, you don't have to make a big deal of it, right? We just give this to everyone. This is, you know, just a bunch of numbers in case you're feeling
something
sad
like that.
or
I feel
depressed
like
or
is-
suicidal, right? Like, any of that. So you can do that. You wouldn't even have to give it to everybody. You could just, like, do it on a case by case basis, but just tell them, like, hey, we provide this to everyone who sat down with us. You know, if you're ever struggling with anything, there you go. And then they choose what to do with it, right? Because you can't force anyone, an adult, to do anything. So
That's true. It's kind of sad though that, like, in a prison setting, if the suicide hotline is like their, like, last resource, like, it's a pretty shitty hotline, honestly. I don't know if we've had
yeah, unfortunately, we are in a situation where mental health supports in Canada in general are pretty bad, right? A lot of it is, like, private, and which requires, like, do you have money, right? Like, there's not even, as far as I know, there's, like, very limited public mental health resources that you can use. And I've had a few acquaintances who worked, like, child psychology, and they're like, yeah, we've got a backlog of people for, like, years, right? Like, you know, and, you know, only the most severe people get the referrals into the child psychology. It's a mess. It's a mess of the system. It needs way more resources, but like everything else, there's no money, right?
That's true.
Gotta pay for everything else.
Yeah, when the